Her hands began to shake as she stared at the screen, convincing herself it had to be a mistake. Someone who looked like him, someone with the same name, but the eyes were unmistakable. The scar near his eyebrow, the same half-smile he used to give her when he knew his secret. The room felt suddenly too small, the years collapsing into a single unbearable second. If Daniel was alive, then everything she believed about the past was wrong, and the truth was about to change her life forever. She had learned how to live with ghosts. For nearly 15 years, Clara carried his death like a quiet scar, never bleeding, never healing, just there. Daniel was supposed to be gone forever. That was what everyone said after the accident, after the closed casket, after the unanswered questions that time eventually forced her to bury. She rebuilt her life carefully, brick by brick. A small apartment, a steady job, evenings filled with routine instead of memories. She told herself that survival was a kind of happiness. That night, it was raining softly against the window as Clara scrolled mindlessly through her laptop, not searching for anything in particular. An old college group had resurfaced online, tagged photos, comments from people she barely remembered. Then she saw a familiar smile. Her breath caught. The name beneath the photo made her heart stutter. Daniel. Older, thinner, alive. Clara didn't remember closing the laptop, only the ringing silence that followed, the kind that presses against your ears when your mind refuses to accept what your eyes have seen. She paced the apartment, barefoot on the cold floor, replaying the image over and over until it felt burned behind her eyelids. 15 years of grief demanded an explanation, and her heart raced ahead of her reason, already screaming that this wasn't a coincidence. She reopened the laptop with trembling fingers and clicked on the profile, every movement slow and deliberate, as if speed might make the truth disappear. The page loaded, and with it came proof she could no longer deny. Recent photos, comments from friends, a birthday post dated just 3 weeks ago. Alive. Not hidden in the past, not frozen in memory, but living somewhere in the present world she occupied. Clara felt anger rise beneath the shock, sharp and sudden, because grief had shaped her entire adulthood while he had continued forward without her. She scrolled deeper, noticing details that made her chest ache. His writing style unchanged, the way he still joked in short sentences, the places he checked into that looked nothing like the life they once planned. Questions collided violently in her mind. Why didn't he contact her? Who told her he was dead? And most terrifying of all, what would it mean if he suddenly reappeared now, when she had finally learned how to breathe without him? Her finger hovered over the message button, heart pounding so loudly she was sure the neighbors could hear it, because one sentence could reopen everything she had sealed shut, and once sent, there would be no way to return to the version of herself who still believed he was gone forever. Laura stepped away from the screen as if distance might protect her, pressing her back against the wall while memories flooded in without permission, vivid and merciless, each one reminding her how completely she had loved a man she was told no longer existed. She remembered the phone call that shattered her world, the official voice on the other end explaining the accident, the confusion, the lack of details, how quickly everything was finalized before she had time to question it. At the time, grief had been too loud for suspicion. Now, with proof of his life glowing behind her on the laptop, every inconsistency screamed for attention. Her hands clenched into fists as a new emotion surfaced beneath the shock and disbelief. Betrayal, raw and overwhelming, not only from Daniel, but from the past itself. 15 years of mourning, of unanswered prayers, of nights spent convincing herself that love sometimes ends without meaning, suddenly felt stolen from her. She wondered who else had known, who had stayed silent while she rebuilt her life on a lie. Returning to the screen, she read his recent posts carefully, searching for signs of guilt or regret, but found none, only fragments of a life that had continued without her. Each scroll deepened the ache in her chest, because the man she once planned a future with had survived while she had learned how to live in his absence. When she finally closed the laptop again, Clara understood that this wasn't just about discovering he was alive. It was about confronting the unbearable truth that the past she accepted was never real, and the answers she deserved were waiting behind a message she was both desperate and terrified to send. Morning arrived without relief, only a dull heaviness that settled into Clara's chest the moment she opened her eyes. Because sleep had offered no escape, only dreams where Daniel existed just out of reach, close enough to recognize, far enough to disappear again. She moved through her routine mechanically, coffee growing cold in her hands as her thoughts circled the same unbearable question. How does someone die in your life and continue living in the world? Every object around her felt like evidence of the years she had lost, years shaped by grief that now felt unnecessary and cruel. She remembered the choices she made because she believed he was gone, the relationships she never fully committed to, the risks she avoided, the quiet resignation she called peace. Sitting at the kitchen table, she opened her laptop again, not with shock this time, but with a growing resolve. She studied his face more carefully now, noticing lines that hadn't been there before, signs of a life lived without her, and the realization cut deeper than anger ever could. If he had survived, then at some point he had chosen silence, or someone had chosen it for him, and either possibility felt like a betrayal she couldn't ignore. Clara understood then that pretending this discovery didn't matter would only prolong the lie she had already lived with for 15 years. The truth, whatever it was, had already entered her life, and avoiding it would not bring back the version of herself who still believed in closure. For the first time since she saw his face on that screen, her fear shifted into something sharper and more focused, because she knew that this story, her story, would not move forward until she confronted the man who was never supposed to be alive at all. Clara stared at the message box for a long time before typing a single word, feeling the weight of 15 silent years press down on her fingers as if they were asking permission to disturb the dead. She erased her first attempt immediately, then the second, because nothing sounded strong enough, and nothing sounded calm enough either. How do you greet someone who is mourned, buried, and carried in your heart as a loss that shaped your entire adulthood? Her pulse raced as she finally began again, choosing words that revealed nothing of the storm inside her, words that could belong to a stranger rather than a woman who once loved him completely. She asked how he was, said she had come across his profile by accident, and stopped there, afraid that anything more would expose the pain she had learned to hide so well. The moment she pressed send, regret followed instantly, sharp and breathless, because now the truth was no longer contained in her thoughts. It was reaching outward, toward him. Minutes passed in unbearable slowness, each one stretching her nerves thinner, until a notification finally appeared. His reply was polite, warm, and impossibly casual, as if no years were missing between them, as if her world had not ended while his continued. He expressed surprise, said it was good to hear from her, asked how life had treated her, and never once mentioned the accident, the disappearance, or the lie she had lived with for so long. Reading his words, Clara felt a strange mixture of relief and rage settle in her chest, because his normalcy made everything feel even more unreal. The past had not returned dramatically or violently, it had slipped quietly back into her life, smiling, unaware of the damage it was about to force into the open. Clara read his message again and again, searching between the lines for acknowledgement, for hesitation, for any sign that he understood what his absence had done to her. But every sentence felt carefully smooth, untouched by the gravity that had defined her last 15 years. The casual tone unsettled her more than anger would have, because it suggested that whatever happened back then had been resolved in his mind, filed away as something finished, while she had spent years learning how to breathe around the shape of his loss. She replied slowly, choosing restraint over accusation. Yet each word felt heavy with questions she refused to ask outright. As the conversation continued, she noticed how easily he slipped into familiarity, referencing shared jokes, moments she had replayed in her grief like sacred memories. And it made her chest tighten with the realization that while she had been mourning, he had been remembering. The imbalance felt cruel. With every message, the truth became harder to avoid. Someone had lied. Someone had allowed her to believe he was dead, and Daniel had been part of that silence, whether he admitted it or not. She felt the old instinct to protect him rise briefly, then disappear, replaced by a steadier clarity born from years of survival. This was no longer about reclaiming what they had lost, but about understanding why she had been left behind to grieve a man who was still alive. And as she typed her next response, Clara knew she was moving closer to answers that might finally explain the emptiness she had carried for so long, even if the truth shattered the last illusion she had been holding on to. The longer they talked, the clearer it became that Daniel was carefully avoiding the moment when truth would be demanded, and Clara felt a growing pressure inside her, a mix of restrained anger and exhausted patience, because every gentle reply felt like another step around a truth that deserved to be spoken aloud. She noticed how he answered questions about his present life easily, but became vague when the past came close. How he shifted timelines, softened details, and framed events as if distance had blurred responsibility. That realization hurt more than confirmation ever could, because it suggested intention rather than confusion. Clara thought back to the days after the accident, the people who comforted her, the official explanations she accepted without protest, and she wondered how many of them were part of a story she had never been meant to question. As she read his words, something inside her finally settled, not resignation, but resolve. She understood that protecting herself no longer meant staying silent or polite. 15 years of loss had already been paid in full. Carefully, deliberately, she typed a message she had avoided until now, one that did not accuse but did not soften either, asking where he was when she was told he was dead and who had decided she didn't deserve the truth. When she sent it, she felt no relief, only a steady calm, because whatever answer came next would finally break the silence that had ruled her life for too long, and for the first time since seeing his face online, she felt ready to hear it. The pause that followed her question stretched longer than any silence before it, and Clara found herself watching the screen with an intensity that bordered on pain, every second amplifying the weight of what she had finally dared to ask. When his reply arrived, it was slower, heavier, and stripped of the casual ease that had defined their earlier exchanges, as if the truth itself resisted being written. Daniel admitted that the accident had been real, but not fatal, that he had been unconscious for days and moved between hospitals under circumstances he claimed were chaotic and confusing, and when he woke he was told she had moved on, that contacting her would only reopen wounds that were already healing. Reading his explanation, Clara felt a sharp bitterness rise, because the words sounded rehearsed, shaped by time and self-preservation rather than honesty. 15 years of grief could not be erased by confusion or good intentions, and the idea that others had decided what was best for her without giving her a choice reignited the pain she thought she had mastered. She realized then that what hurt most was not simply believing he was dead, but being denied the agency to grieve, to question, to choose for herself. The truth, as incomplete as it was, forced her to confront a reality more unsettling than loss. That silence had been chosen for her, and that choice had redirected the entire course of her life. Closing her eyes, Clara understood that no explanation could return what had been taken, but the truth, however flawed, had finally begun to surface, and with it came a clarity that made turning back impossible. Clara sat with his explanation long after the screen went dark, letting the words settle while a deeper understanding slowly took shape. One that was less about the accident itself and more about the choices that followed it. Chaos and confusion might explain silence in the beginning, but 15 years could not be excused so easily. And she felt a quiet anger surface as she realized how many opportunities there had been to tell the truth and how deliberately each one had been ignored. She thought about the birthdays she spent alone, the holidays that felt incomplete, the relationships she kept at arm's length because loving fully had once cost her everything, and she understood now that those losses were not accidents, but consequences of decisions made without her consent. What unsettled her most was recognizing that Daniel's version of events centered on protecting comfort rather than confronting responsibility, and that realization stripped away the last traces of the man she once believed she knew. As she reflected on the life she had built despite the lie, Clara felt something unexpected replace her anger. Not forgiveness, but clarity. She no longer needed him to validate her pain or justify her survival. The truth had finally surfaced, and it belonged to her now, not as a wound, but as a boundary. And in that quiet moment of reckoning, she understood that whatever came next would not be about reclaiming the past, but about choosing a future where her truth could no longer be rewritten by someone else's silence. When Clara finally wrote back, her words were calm, measured, and deliberate, not because the pain had faded, but because she refused to let it control the direction of her life any longer. She told him that understanding the circumstances did not undo the years she had spent grieving a man who was still breathing somewhere in the same world, and that explanations, no matter how carefully framed, could never replace the choice that had been taken from her. As she typed, she realized she was no longer seeking apologies or reconciliation, only acknowledgement of the truth and the impact it had left behind. Daniel's reply came slowly, carrying remorse that felt genuine yet insufficient, and for the first time, Clara saw him not as the love she lost or the ghost she mourned, but as a flawed human being who had made choices and lived with them while she had borne the weight of their consequences. That clarity grounded her. She closed the conversation not with bitterness, but with resolve, understanding that closure does not always come from reunion or forgiveness, but from reclaiming ownership of your own story. Sitting alone in the quiet afterward, Clara felt an unexpected lightness settle in her chest, because the past had finally been named, faced, and placed where it belonged. He was no longer a shadow haunting her present, but a chapter that had ended at last, and for the first time in 15 years, she felt free to move forward without carrying the burden of a life built on silence.